Some men spend half a lifetime running from one moment they failed to face. Hank Ward was about to learn whether a second chance could cost him his life. Red Fork, Nebraska, 1888. Rafe Kane had Clara Bell's wrist pinned against a saloon table, the flat of his revolver pressed cold against her cheek. If she signed away the land, she might keep breathing and keep her boarding house. If she refused, everyone in the room could see what Rafe meant to take next. Clara did not beg. Her free hand stayed wrapped around the edge of a serving tray, while sweat gathered beneath the hair at her temple. The piano had stopped. Cards lay forgotten on green felt. 30 people sat close enough to hear Rafe breathe whiskey across her face, and not one moved. Behind the bar, Sam Pike glanced toward the shotgun beneath the counter. His hand started down, then stopped. Rafe noticed. "You've had 3 chances to sell." Clara met his eyes. "And you've had the same answer 3 times. The barrel pressed harder against her skin. Outside, prairie wind pushed red dust beneath the swinging doors and scraped grit across the floorboards. At a back table, Hank Ward set down his coffee. I was 56, gray at the jaw, stiff from weeks in the saddle, dressed like a traveler who wanted no part of another town's trouble. That was exactly what he had intended to be, a stranger, a room for the night, then the road again. One of Rafe's hired men watched Hank rise. The other eased his chair back just enough to clear his gun hand. Hank noticed both. Then he looked at Clara. She was afraid. He could see it in the faint tremor running through the tray beneath her hand. But she still had not said yes. Hank took one step, then another. Boot leather sounded heavy against the old boards. Rafe turned at last. His eyes traveled over Hank's worn coat, gray stubble, and tired posture. He smiled. "This isn't your business, old-timer." Hank stopped behind his shoulder. For one brief second, the swinging doors stood open behind him, and the empty road waited beyond them. "I could still leave." Then Rafe tightened his grip on Clara's wrist. Hank's face went still. "It became my business when you put a gun on her." The smile left Rafe's face. One hired man rose, then the second. Sam Pike did not move. Clara did not breathe. And Hank Ward understood that he had just closed the only door in Red Fork that still led back to an ordinary life. A few hours earlier, Hank Ward had ridden into Red Fork beneath a white Nebraska sky, with prairie dust clinging to his coat and 3 weeks of road in his bones. I had no reason to stay longer than one night. The town looked like 100 others that had grown beside the railroad. Cattle bawled behind rough pens near the tracks. Grain dust hung around the warehouses. A locomotive hissed somewhere beyond the depot. Iron, cooling under the afternoon sun. Hank led Scout toward a narrow boarding house at the edge of the business street. Clara Bell opened the door before he could knock twice. She was 39, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair pinned back without much care for fashion, and she looked at him the way a woman living alone learned to look at strangers. "Room's $1. Hank reached into his coat. "Breakfast?" "I work evenings at the saloon." Her answer came flat and practical. "The bank called my note early. Breakfast costs me more than it used to." Hank placed the dollar in her palm without bargaining. Something in Clara's face shifted, though only for a second. Most men passing through Red Fork tried to save a nickel wherever they could. This one seemed more interested in silence. She showed him the room, then pointed toward the small paddock behind the house. Hank unsaddled Scout and rubbed the old horse down himself. From the fence line, he could see the corner of Clara's property running toward the rail corridor. Survey stakes stood farther off in the grass. Beyond them were Rafe Kane's cattle pens. Clara saw where he was looking. "I wants that corner." Hank glanced at her. "Who does?" "Rafe Kane." She said the name without lowering her voice. "He's offered 3 times. And you said no." 3 times. No anger, no pride, just a fact. Hank looked again toward the stakes. A short spur from those pens to the main line would save Kane time, cattle weight, and money. Clara's ground sat directly in the way. By sundown, Hank was walking toward the Silver Fork for supper when he noticed 2 saddled horses tied outside a dark mercantile. Neither cinch had been loosened. Both riders had left their gun belts on. Men settling in for the evening did not usually keep their horses ready to run. Hank slowed for half a step, then kept walking. He had come to Red Fork for a bed and a meal, but before he ever reached the saloon doors, the town had already begun warning him that somebody expected trouble. The Silver Fork was nearly full by the time Hank stepped through the doors. Heat from the lamps sat heavy beneath the ceiling, mixing with cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey soaked into old boards. Hank chose a table near the back. Coffee, supper, and no conversation. That was still the plan. From there, he could see most of the room without turning his head. Rafe Kane sat near the center with 2 hired men beside him. Clean coat, polished boots, a fresh glass appearing before the old one was empty. Sam Pike poured it without asking, and never reached for money. At the next table, 2 cattlemen spoke low enough to pretend they were being careful. She should have sold. Land's hers. Won't matter if Kane decides otherwise. Neither man looked toward Clara. Hank did. She moved between tables with the controlled pace of someone who knew exactly where trouble sat, and how much room it expected around itself. Rafe watched her every time she crossed the floor, not the way a lonely man watched a woman, the way a buyer watched property he believed had already been priced. Clara carried a fresh bottle to his table. She set it down and turned away. Rafe caught her wrist. Sit. I have tables waiting. His fingers tightened. Every conversation around them thinned into silence. Clara did not pull against him. That would only give him something to display. She stood still instead. Rafe drew his revolver. Slowly, he laid the barrel against her cheek. Sam Pike's eyes dropped beneath the bar. One hand followed, then stopped. Rafe looked around the room. You've all had long enough to learn how things work here. No one answered. This woman thinks one corner of dirt is worth holding up business that feeds half this town. Clara's jaw tightened. It feeds you. A chair creaked somewhere behind Hank. Nobody stood. Rafe leaned closer. You want to keep that house, Clara? You signed the deed. She looked him in the eye. No. The word barely carried past the table. It still seemed to strike harder than a shout. Hank felt something old shift in his chest. A room. A gun. A man. Waiting for help. He shut the memory down before it could take shape. Then he set his coffee aside and rose. Across the saloon, one of Rafe's hired men noticed. Then the other. Hank walked toward them without hurry. Rafe turned at the sound of his boots. Hank stopped behind his shoulder. Let her go. The whole room went still. And this time, nobody could pretend they had not heard him. For a moment, Rafe only stared at Hank. Then amusement returned to his face. This isn't your business, old-timer. Hank's hands stayed loose at his sides. It became my business when you put a gun on her. Clara looked at him then, not with relief, with warning. She had lived in Red Fork long enough to know what happened to men who embarrassed Rafe Kane in front of witnesses. Rafe released her wrist at last, but the revolver stayed in his hand. His 2 hired men rose from their table. One moved left. The other came around Hank's right side. Hank saw the shape forming. 2 men. Close range. Too many chairs behind him. Too many frightened people who would dive the wrong direction if gunfire started. His Colt remained under his coat. Han had no wish to draw it in that room. Walk away, Rafe said. Hank glanced once toward the doors. The road was still there. So was the choice. Then he looked back at Clara. A red mark had already begun to show around her wrist. Hank stayed where he was. The first blow came from his left. A fist drove hard beneath his ribs and folded him before he could turn. Air vanished from his lungs. The second man caught his arm and slammed him face first into the edge of a table. Wood cracked. So did something inside Hank's mouth. Blood filled his tongue. His knees hit the floor. The room blurred beneath lamplight. His hand reached for the Colt. Too late. Someone twisted his arm behind him. The revolver slipped free beneath his coat and struck the floor. It spun once through the sawdust and disappeared under a nearby table. Neither hired man saw where it went. Clara did. Hank was dragged upright by both arms. His boots barely found the floor as they hauled him toward the doors. Rafe laughed behind them. Toss him outside. The doors burst open. Hank hit the packed dirt hard enough to send fresh pain through his ribs. For several seconds, he could do nothing but breathe in shallow pieces. The saloon doors swung shut again. Laughter returned inside. Uncertain at first, then louder because Rafe expected it. Hank pressed one hand to his mouth and found blood. I had stood up, and it had changed nothing. Not yet. Inside the silver fork. Clara lowered her eyes toward the shadow beneath the broken table. The worn grip of Hank Ward's Colt lay half hidden in the sawdust, and Rafe Kane had not noticed it. Clara waited until Rafe turned back toward his table. Then she moved. Not quickly enough to draw attention, not slowly enough to lose her nerve. She bent as if gathering a fallen napkin, reached beneath the broken table, and closed her fingers around the worn grip of Hank Ward's Colt. The metal was warm from the room, heavy enough to remind her what carrying it meant. She slipped it beneath her apron and went through the kitchen without looking back. Outside, Hank had managed to pull himself around the side of the building. He sat against the wall with one knee raised, breathing shallowly through the pain in his ribs. Blood darkened his lower lip. Clara came to him with a basin and a clean rag. "You should have stayed down." Hank gave a tired look toward the saloon doors. "Probably." She knelt and pressed the wet cloth gently against his mouth. Unflinched. "You didn't have to do that." "Didn't have to." His voice was rough. "Chose to anyway." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Most men who offered help wanted gratitude attached to it. Hank seemed to want nothing except enough breath to sit upright. "They took your gun." "No." Clara's hand paused. Hank looked at her apron. They only thought they did. For the first time that evening, the corner of her mouth nearly moved. She drew the Colt out and laid it across her palm. "I saw it fall." Hank took the revolver carefully. He opened the cylinder. 5 cartridges. One an empty chamber beneath the hammer, exactly as he had left it. "Much obliged." Clara sat back on her heels. "If Rafe finds out I gave you that, I'm finished pretending this is only about a deed." Hank met her eyes. "You could have left it inside." "So could you." The words landed between them. No softness, no promise, only recognition. Hank holstered the Colt beneath his coat. Clara dipped the rag into the basin again. "Why did you stand up in there?" Hank's face changed before he answered. The saloon noise behind the wall seemed to fade. For 1 second, he was listening to something much farther away. "I rode away once when I should have stayed." Clara waited. Hank looked toward the dirt at his boots. "Been paying for it ever since." I said nothing more, and Clara understood that Rafe Kane was not the first man to put Hank Ward in front of a choice he wished he could forget. Clara wrung the blood from the rag and watched it disappear into the basin in thin red ribbons. "You need to leave Red Fork." Hank leaned his head back against the wall. "That your medical opinion?" "It's the opinion of a woman who's watched Rafe Kane get what he wants for years." The faint humor left his face. Clara lowered her voice. "He controls who gets work, who gets credit, whose cattle move first." She glanced toward the saloon. "You embarrassed him in front of the whole town." Hank said nothing. "They'll kill you if you go back in there." For a while, only the prairie wind answered. Dust moved along the alley, and a loose board rattled above the kitchen door. Hank closed his eyes. A different room came back to him in pieces. Lamplight, a revolver clearing leather, a young deputy standing alone near a bar. The boy had looked at Hank once, not begging, just waiting. Hank had known what that look meant. He had also known what stepping forward might cost, so he had stayed quiet. Then he had walked away. Years had passed, but some choices did not grow smaller with distance. Clara studied him. "You don't owe me whatever happened back then." "No." Hank opened his eyes. "I don't." "Then don't die trying to settle an old account with a man who wasn't there." That struck closer than she intended. Hank looked toward the street where Scout waited beyond the boarding house. His horse was saddled. His room was paid. By morning, Red Fork could be behind him. That was what he had wanted when he rode in. Quiet. Distance. No one depending on him. Clara rose and lifted the basin. "If you leave now, I won't think less of you." Hank pushed one hand against the wall and forced himself upright. Pain caught beneath his ribs and stopped him halfway. He waited until it passed, then stood fully. "Hank." He adjusted his coat over the Colt, already left once when it mattered. "You don't even know me." "No." He looked toward the saloon doors. "But I know what happens when everybody decides somebody else ought to stand up." Clara held his gaze. For the first time, fear showed plainly in hers, not for herself, for him. Hank turned away before that could change his mind. Each step toward the silver fork hurt more than the last. Behind him, Clara remained beside the wall, with the bloody rag in her hand. Ahead, lamplight. spilled beneath the saloon doors, and Hank Ward walked toward the one room in Red Fork, where he could no longer pretend he was only passing through. The Silver Fork doors opened hard enough to strike the wall. Every face in the room turned. Hank Ward stood in his doorway with blood dried along his mouth, one eye swelling dark, and one arm held close against the ribs that made every breath hurt. Rafe Kane had stopped laughing. For a few seconds, nobody said a word. Hank stepped inside. Then another step. The floorboards seemed louder now, not because he walked differently, because the room was listening. Rafe leaned back in his chair. Should have stayed down, old-timer. Hank wiped his mouth with the back of one hand. Should have. I kept walking. Didn't. One of Rafe's hired men shifted near the wall. The other watched Hank's coat, where the Colt now rested beneath the cloth. Hank stopped several paces from the table. I did not draw. You cut her credit. Rafe's face hardened. You kept Joe Ames working your ranch when you knew her porch needed fixing. A chair scraped somewhere behind them. You sat close enough to the bank to know exactly what that neglect would do to her note. Rafe rose slowly. You come back in here to preach? No. Hank glanced around the room. I came back because every man here already knows what you've been doing. Sam Pike stood behind the bar with both hands flat on the wood. Hank looked toward him. Some of them just got used to calling it business. That landed harder than Rafe expected. A cattleman near the wall lowered his eyes. Another man stopped pretending to study his cards. Clara had returned through the kitchen doorway. She stayed near the back, pale but upright. Hank saw her for the first time since entering. Something in his shoulders eased, only slightly. Rafe noticed that too. This town needs my cattle. His voice sharpened. It needs that spur. Maybe, Hank said. But needing a railroad doesn't make her land yours. Silence settled over the room. Sam Pike looked down at the shotgun beneath the bar. This time his hand reached it. He lifted it slowly, not toward Rafe, not toward Hank. He laid it flat across the counter. The sound of wood and steel touching wood was small, but everyone heard it. Then a chair moved. A rancher stood, then another. Rafe looked around the Silver Fork and finally understood what Hank had risked his life to force into the open. The town was no longer pretending not to see him. No one cheered. That would have been easier. Red Fork did something far more dangerous. It stopped being afraid in silence. The rancher he arrested the window rose first. Slowly, as though his knees had forgotten how, another man pushed his chair away from Rafe's table. Sam Pike kept the shotgun lying across the bar. His hands rested beside it. I did not point the weapon. I did not have to. Rafe looked from one face to the next. Men who had borrowed from the same bank. Men who sold cattle through the same yards. Men who had spent years deciding that keeping their heads down was cheaper than crossing him. Now they were looking back. Clara stepped farther into the room. The red mark around her wrist had darkened. Rafe saw it. His jaw tightened. You think this changes anything? Clara answered. Before Hank could, it already has. Her voice was quiet. That made the words carry farther. Rafe turned toward her. You still owe the bank. I know. You still need that house. I know that too. And when the note comes due? Clara held his stare. I'll answer for what I owe. Then she looked at the revolver in his hand. Not for what you want. Hank did not move. That mattered. A younger man might have filled the silence with threats. Hank had already learned what rushing could cost. One of Rafe's hired men slowly removed his hand from his holster. I took a step toward the wall. Rafe stared at him. You work for me. The man swallowed. Not for this. The second hired gun stayed where he was. His fingers hovered near the grip of his revolver. Sweat showed along his temple. Hank saw it. So did Rafe. The power Rafe had built in Red Fork had never rested only on money. It depended on everyone believing the next man would stay seated. That belief was breaking in front of him. Hank could feel the room changing. But he also knew when like Rafe became most dangerous when obedience stopped working. Clara knew it too. Her eyes went to Rafe's gun hand. Rafe's breathing changed. Once, twice. His pride had carried him too far to retreat without witnesses remembering it. Hank's right hand remained low beside his coat. Don't, he said. It was not a threat. It was the last warning he intended to give. Rafe's eyes narrowed. Then his hand dropped toward the revolver, and the second hired gun moved with him. Rafe Kane moved first. His hand dropped for the revolver at his hip. The hired gun beside him followed a heartbeat later. Hank's Colt cleared leather before either man had finished the draw. Hunt fired once. The hired man jerked sideways as the bullet struck high in the shoulder. His revolver flew from his hand and hit the floor beneath a chair. A woman near the wall gasped. Nobody else made a sound. Hank turned the Colt toward Rafe. His ribs burned with every breath. Blood had started at his lip again, but the barrel stayed steady. Put it down. Rafe froze with his revolver half clear. The whole silver fork seemed to hold itself between one breath and the next. Hank did not advance. I did not raise his voice. Last easy choice you're getting tonight. For 1 second, Rafe looked toward the men who had stood against him. Sam Pike, behind the bar. The ranchers near the wall. Clara Bell, beside the kitchen doorway. No one lowered their eyes. That was the part Rafe could not bear. Not the gun pointed at him. Not Hank Ward. The witnesses. 15 years of fear had depended on every man in Red Fork, believing resistance would leave him alone. Now Rafe was the one standing alone. His fingers tightened around the grip. Clara saw it. Hank. She said his name once, quietly. A warning, not a plea. Hank saw Rafe's wrist turn. I knew the difference between surrender and a man finishing a draw. Rafe finished it. Hank fired. The shot cracked through the room and disappeared into a silence larger than the sound itself. Rafe struck the edge of his chair and went down hard. His revolver landed beside him. I did not reach for it again. Hank remained standing. For a moment, he looked less like a victor than a man trying to understand the weight that had just entered his hand. The wounded gunman pressed himself against the wall, pale and shaking. The other hired man raised both hands. His weapon had never left its holster. Sam Pike slowly moved the shotgun farther from the edge of the bar. Clara crossed 1 step toward Hank, then stopped. There was nothing to celebrate. A man was dead, another was bleeding, and Hank Ward had gotten the second chance he once thought he wanted. It had cost exactly what he had feared it might. Outside, hoofbeats struck the hard street. Sheriff Will Hart was coming. Hank looked down at the Colt in his hand. The fight was over. Now Red Fork would decide what that fight had meant. Sheriff Will Hart entered the Silver Fork with dust on his boots. He found Rafe Kane dead beside an overturned chair. One hired man, bleeding from the shoulder. Hank Ward, standing with his Colt lowered. And 30 witnesses who had finally decided silence was no longer cheaper than the truth. Will took Hank's gun without ceremony. Then he began asking questions. Sam Pike answered first. Clara answered next. By the time a third witness told the same story, the shape of the night was difficult to bend. Rafe had put a gun on Clara. His men had attacked Hank. Hank had returned. Rafe had drawn after being warned to stop. The formal inquiry that followed did not erase the blood from the floor. It only decided what the law could do with it. Hank faced no charge. The wounded gunman lived. The bank's dealings with Clara's note drew attention they had avoided while Rafe was alive. Men who once found reasons not to speak began finding reasons to cooperate. Joe Ames came to Clara's boarding house the next morning with his tools. He'd repaired the porch without making a speech about it. Sam Pike stopped charging Clara for meals until she threatened to leave money on the bar anyway. The railroad did not disappear. Neither did the cattle pens. A spur could still be built, but Clara's ground would have to be negotiated for instead of taken through fear. 2 mornings later, Hank saddled Scout behind the boarding house. His ribs were bound tight beneath his shirt. The swelling around his eye had begun to fade. Clara walked out carrying a folded piece of paper. You're leaving. Hank tightened the girth. That was the plan when I rode in. She looked toward the quiet street. And now? Hank paused. Plans are easier than staying. Clara held out the paper. It was his room receipt. The dollar charge had been crossed out. Beneath it, in Clara's careful hand, were 3 words, paid in full. Hank read them twice. You don't owe me anything, Clara said. He folded the receipt and slipped it inside his coat. For a moment, neither moved. No kiss, no promise. Only the wind passing through the prairie grass beyond the fence. Hank mounted. Clara rested one hand on the gate. Thank you for coming back. Hank looked at her. Made the wrong choice once. He touched the brim of his hat. Didn't want to make it twice. Scout carried him toward the open prairie. Red Fork grew smaller. Behind him, the old memory remained, but for the first time in years, it no longer weighed quite the same. Thank you for riding with us through Red Fork tonight. Hank Ward could not undo the choice he made years ago, But when the moment came again, he chose to stay. If this story of courage, justice, and second chances stayed with you, subscribe for more Western tales from the American frontier. And tell us in the comments, would you have walked back into that saloon, knowing what it might cost? Until the next trail, take care, ride safe, and remember that sometimes one brave choice can change more than one life. Disclaimer: this is a fictional Western romance story inspired by life on the 19th century American frontier. Characters, events, dialogue, and dramatic situations are created for storytelling purposes. Historical settings and cultural details are researched for authenticity.